So today we are talking about a new result in physics that shows the imaginary is real. And I'm going to explain what exactly I mean by that. But the major point that I want to get across is that this is something that we have been saying for years. Hyperionism, ontological mathematics has been making this assertion for years and years and years. And finally, physics is very slowly catching up to what we have been saying. And I want to start really pointing out these developments because you're going to be seeing this happen more and more because we are the science of the future. We've already mapped all this out, and physics is such a slow and really outdated system that we are replacing. So today we're talking about the imaginary being real, and we're going to do a crash course in some ontological mathematics ideas. So as most of you know, in Hyperionism, reality is mathematical. This is a mathematical reality, and it reflects the principle of sufficient reason. This is a rational reality. So in mathematics, there is something known as imaginary numbers. And I'm going to explain to you what imaginary numbers are. And don't worry, it's actually not that difficult to understand. But the point to take away from here is that imaginary is a bit of a misnomer. An imaginary number is just like any other number, except that it has a very specific, a very special property, right? Just like you can have a positive number or a negative number. A negative number is like a positive number. It just has a slightly different property. Mathematically speaking, it's actually rotated 180 degrees, but just bear with me for a moment. So what is an imaginary number? Well, to give you an idea, if you take, if you're familiar with taking square roots, okay? So let's say you want to take the square root of -1. Well, what is the square root of -1? Well, it can't be 1 because 1 times 1 is 1. And it can't be -1 because -1 times -1 is also 1. So what is the square root of -1? What do you have to multiply with itself to get -1? It can't be 1 and it can't be -1. Well, the answer is it's a different type of number known as an imaginary number. And it's denoted by the letter I. So I times I is -1. And why this is important is because in ontological mathematics, we know that this is a mathematical reality. And so we need mathematics to be perfect, complete, and consistent. And so we know that in addition to there being positive real numbers and negative real numbers, we know that imaginary numbers must exist as well. Now, why do we know that? Well, because if they didn't exist, mathematics would be incomplete. Because if you were to ask the question, what's the square root of -1? If imaginary numbers didn't exist, that would mean there would be no answer to that question. And that means that mathematics is complete. We need to have the imaginary numbers to be able to make mathematics complete, perfect, and consistent. So you see how, imagine it being like, so what I mean to say by this is that imaginary numbers are an integral part of mathematics for it to be complete. Imagine if you tried to do math, but you didn't have the number 5. Well, mathematics would break, so to speak. There would be all these things and operations that you couldn't do, that couldn't take place because you were missing a crucial part of it, the number 5. There would be tons of things that you couldn't do. What would 3 plus 2 equal if you didn't have 5? Well, same sort of thing with the imaginary number. And one example of that is the square root of negative numbers. If you don't have this critical type of number, mathematics breaks. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about imaginary numbers. And again, don't worry, it's not too complicated. But the important thing to understand here is that in physics, they have denied the existence of imaginary numbers. For example, because they can't find what imaginary numbers would correspond to physically. For example, you can have 5 apples on a table, and they'd go, okay, well, that corresponds to 5. You can owe someone 5 apples, and that'd be like, okay, well, that corresponds to -5. But physicists would be like, well, what is I? You can't have I apples. What does that even mean? So physicists have denied the reality of imaginary numbers because they can't find anything that corresponds to it physically in reality. However, in ontological mathematics, we know that this isn't a physical reality. We know this is a mathematical reality. And through reason, we know that we require imaginary numbers for mathematics to be complete. So rationally and logically, we know that imaginary numbers must be real and that they must exist. So throughout physics and in quantum mechanics, imaginary numbers pop up everywhere. And imaginary numbers are all over the place. You cannot, carry out many calculations in quantum mechanics without imaginary numbers. So, this perturbs physicists because they want to deny imaginary numbers. So basically what they do is they employ mathematical tricks to insert imaginary numbers into their calculations, do the calculations, and then when they're done, they get rid of the imaginary numbers by doing things like multiplying by the complex conjugate or something like that to get rid of the imaginary numbers, because they don't want the imaginary numbers to have any reality. However, a recent experiment in physics has shown that imaginary numbers are in fact critical to quantum mechanics, that they're not just some sort of tool that you can use and then get away, throw in the trash at the end. And this is something, again, that we have been saying for years and years and years. It's like, hey, you need imaginary numbers for reality to work because this is a mathematical reality. You can't just sneak them into your equations and then get rid of them at the end, like as if they were never there. You can't just sweep them under the rug. They do actually exist, and they are critical for reality to function correctly. And again, this is something that I'm going to be showing you is vindicated now in physics. And the reason why this is so important is because, once again, this is something that we have been saying for years and years and years. And this is because we can know it rationally. We don't have to go out and do sensory experiments in the physical world because we know logically and rationally that it must exist. And physicists are now just starting to catch up and understand this. And the reason why we know it exists is because this is a mathematical reality, and we know, imagine if reality were a video game, you would know what the video game was like based on the code. We have the code of reality. We know that there are certain parts of the code that must actualize in a certain way. We know that all parts of the code must be complete and consistent, etc. So I'm going to dive into these results in physics and explain them to you, but let me just give you a little bit of a more of a flavor of what imaginary numbers are and what they have to do with Hyperionism. So I want to show you something that you may be familiar with. So if you've ever taken a class in, you should be familiar with the XY coordinate plane from algebra, all right? So, you have the x-axis and the y-axis. Most of you should be familiar with this. So to bring in imaginary numbers, the only thing different is I know the screen is small, but if you look very, very closely, in the vertical axis here, instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, we have 1i, 2i, 3i, 4i. And below that, instead of -1, -2, -3, -4, we have -1i, -2i, -3i, and -4i. And that's it. To get imaginary numbers, all you do is you put i's in front of the vertical axis. And it just denotes that it is a special kind of number. This is called the complex plane, or an Argand diagram, or a Gaussian plane. Very fancy words. All it means is, hey, the vertical axis, put i's in front of the number. That's all it means. And again, don't let that confuse you or scare you, because they're just sort of like, you know how in negative numbers, to denote that a number is negative, well, you just put a negative sign in front of it. Well, with imaginary numbers, you just put an I in front or after it. And that's how you denote an imaginary number. And so what is an imaginary number? Well, imaginary numbers have a very special property in that when you multiply them i's together, you get a negative number. You know, 1i times 1i is -1. And here's another way to really start to grasp it, because you know, when you start to get into mathematics, you start to look at numbers in a different way, and really how a helpful way of looking at numbers is with rotation. Okay, so if you're looking at real numbers, well, you can see that the real numbers are going this way. Okay, so if you look at 1, you know, 1 is, you know, right about here. All right, here we are at 1. Now, if you were to do -1, well, what is -1 in relation to 1? It's a 180-degree rotation. When you go from 1 and you rotate over 180 degrees, you get -1. That's what a negative number is. It's a 180-degree rotation. And you know, this should kind of intuitively make sense to you, because, you know, negative is sort of like the opposite. Negative puts you in the opposite direction. So what is I? I is simply a 90-degree rotation. So I is a 90-degree rotation. That's really it's just a rotational difference. And it lies in between the negatives and the positives. It adds that extra dimension there. And so it's really a pretty simple concept. Now, there's one other thing that I want to talk about here before we can really start to understand this, is that there's another type of number called a complex number. And the only difference, and what a complex number is complex. So you see how the real numbers lie on the horizontal axis and the imaginary numbers lie on the vertical axis. Complex numbers are all the numbers in between. You know, you can have a number here, you can have a number here, you can have a number here, you can have a number, you know, over here, you could have a number over here. So, you know, if you have a number, so let's say you start at 1 and then you go up to 1i. What's that number? Well, it's the complex number 1 plus 1i. And if you were to go over 2 and up 2, that would be 2 plus 2i. If you were to go over 3 and up 2, well, that would be 3 plus 2i. So complex numbers are a fusion of real and imaginary numbers, like 1 plus 1i. But even though it has two parts to it, it's still one number. So the number 1 plus 1i is a single number, a complex number that has a real part and an imaginary part. So we have real numbers, we have negative real numbers, we have imaginary numbers, we have negative imaginary numbers, and we have complex numbers. And so in Hyperionism, in ontological mathematics, we've been saying for years that this is necessary for existence, but physicists have tried to deny imaginary numbers. Because again, well, what are imaginary numbers? You can have 5 apples, but you can't have I apples. Well, in Hyperionism, I actually relates to time. So in Hyperionism, I is associated with time, whereas real numbers are associated with space. And once again, the reason why that I is so important to Hyperionism again is take a look at, for those of you who don't know, once again, Hyperionism asserts this is a mathematical reality, and the source formula is the the formula for all of existence, okay? So I've shown this, I'm sure most of you are familiar with this, but this is the source formula. And the source formula is a circle. You can see in the corner, it's a circle, and it results in sinusoidal waveforms, okay? So it's a formula that is a circle and waveforms at the same time. For those who are familiar with mathematics, it's Euler's formula, e to the ix equals cosine x plus I sine x. So this is the formula for all reality. Reality is mathematical, reality is frequency. But guess what? Embedded within the source formula, it requires imaginary numbers. So again, here is a close-up view of what the source formula results in. Once again, you have real numbers and also imaginary numbers, and everything in between are complex numbers. So in order to have the source formula, in order to have waves, in order to have frequency, you require imaginary numbers. And imaginary numbers are everywhere. They're in quantum mechanics, they're in electromagnetism, light waves, frequency processing, the Fourier transform. You can't get away from it. Same thing with the source formula. The source formula is embedded in everything. Fourier transforms, frequency processing, quantum mechanics. It's everywhere in wave mechanics and quantum mechanics because it's at the very heart of existence. So, long story short, in Hyperionism, in ontological mathematics, we know that imaginary numbers can and must exist. And this now, and we have known this and have been saying this based on reason. We can rationally know that this is true. And that's a big difference between rationalism and empiricism right there. We know this is true. Just like in a video game, you'd have to be like, well, we know that the code exists. You don't have to do an experiment to know that the code exists when you're in a video game. You can know it logically. Just like when you're dreaming, you can know logically that for there to be a dream, there has to be a dreamer. And so this is something that we've known and we've been saying. And I'd like to point out this article now. And if you can see here, physicists prove that the imaginary part of quantum mechanics really exists. And again, the reason why I'm pointing this out is because you'll notice that there are so many trolls and so many people who, go, oh yeah, what you guys are talking about, that's so ridiculous. And then, but we are constantly vindicated again and again and again and again and again by new results in physics and other areas as well. So, people would perhaps laugh at us for saying something like this, but this has now been vindicated. And I want to keep you guys updated on this to show how we are continuously light years ahead of the game. So an international research team has proven that the imaginary part of quantum mechanics can be observed in action in the real world. And again, another reason why that I'm reading this to you is because I want to show you that the things that I'm talking about aren't just, they are not things that I'm just pulling out of my ass. This is all very true, very real, and something that you can read about in mainstream literature. So for almost a century, physicists have been intrigued by the fundamental question: why are complex numbers so important in quantum mechanics? That is, numbers containing a component with the imaginary number I. Usually it was assumed that they are only a mathematical trick to facilitate the description of phenomena, and only results expressed in real numbers have a physical meaning. That's exactly what I just told you guys. And you can even look this up in quantum mechanics textbooks or courses, because this is a very recent result. But previous to this, it's been that the imaginary numbers, complex numbers, they're just a trick. They're just a tool that we use. So we're going to use them but then we're going to take the complex conjugate, then we're going to get rid of them after we're done, and make sure that our results only have real numbers. We're going to sweep them under the rug. They do a mathematical operation to get rid of the imaginary numbers after they use them, because they don't want them to remain in equations, because they don't like them. So, and that's exactly what it just said. It was assumed that they were only a mathematical trick, and only results expressed in real numbers have a physical meaning. However, a Polish-Chinese-Canadian team of researchers has proved that the imaginary part of quantum mechanics can be observed in action in the real world. We need to significantly reconstruct our naive ideas about the ability of numbers to describe the physical world. Until now, it seemed that only real numbers were related to measurable physical quantities. However, research conducted by the team of Dr. Alexander Streltsov of the Center for Quantum Optical Technologies, etc., found quantum states of entangled photons that cannot be distinguished without resorting to complex numbers. Moreover, the researchers also conducted an experiment confirming the importance of quantum numbers for quantum mechanics. And this is a quote from one of the doctors. In physics, complex numbers were considered to be purely mathematical in nature. It is true that although they play a basic role in quantum mechanics equations, they were treated simply as a tool, something to facilitate calculations for physicists. Now we have theoretically and experimentally proved that there are quantum states that can only be distinguished when the calculations are performed with the indispensable participation of complex numbers. Remember, complex numbers has a real part and an imaginary part. And it says right here, complex numbers are made up of two components, real and imaginary. They have the form a plus bi, where the numbers a and b are real. The bi component is responsible for the specific features of complex numbers. The key role here is played by the imaginary number I, that is the square root of -1. There is nothing in the physical world that can be directly related to the number I. If there are 2 or 3 apples on a table, this is natural. When we take one apple away, we can speak of a physical deficiency and describe it with a negative integer, -1. We can cut the apple into 2 or 3 sections, obtaining the physical equivalents of the rational numbers 1/2 or 1/3. If the table is a perfect square, its diagonal will be the irrational square of 2. At the same time, with the best will in the world, it's still impossible to put I apples on the table. And this is why physicists have hated the number I and wanted to get rid of it, because they're like, oh shit, we can have 5 apples, we can have -5 apples if we're missing, we can have half an apple, we can have a third of an apple, etc., etc. But what could I possibly mean? And first of all, in ontological mathematics, we go, hey, it doesn't fucking matter. You don't need to have a physical correspondence that is observable, by the human senses. We know that I is required in mathematics, or mathematics would be incomplete. For example, you would not be able to answer the question, what's the square root of -1? And that would be like having computer code that had an error in it. The game would crash. Likewise, if there were no imaginary numbers, physical reality would crash because it would contain errors. It would be incomplete. There would be no answer to what is the answer to the square root of -1. So we require imaginary numbers. This is a mathematical reality. Things don't have to be physically observable. Now, that being said, in ontological mathematics, in Hyperionism, what are imaginary numbers? What do they correspond to? It's time. Time. Imaginary numbers correspond to time. So the surprising career of complex numbers, remember, complex numbers is just a real part and an imaginary part, in physics is related to the fact that they can be used to describe all sorts of oscillations much more conveniently than with the use of popular trigonometric functions. Calculations are therefore carried out using complex numbers, and then at the end, only the real numbers in them are taken into account. So basically what this means is imaginary numbers and complex numbers are extremely powerful. Physicists will use them but then when they're done with them, they'll take them out. A simple way to understand of how they take them out, I mean, what they do is they'll, multiply by the complex conjugate or something like this. But if you're not familiar with these different calculations, basically what it means is, you know how if you multiply I and I together, you get -1? It's like, oh, well, that's a real number. So basically what they'll do is they'll perform multiplications like this, where they'll take their equations, multiply it in a specific way, so that all the i's disappear or annihilate each other, and you're only left with real numbers. So they'll use the i's and complex numbers in their equations, and then get rid of them. And now, why is imaginary numbers so powerful? Because as we looked at in the beginning, remember when I was describing to you how it's a 90-degree rotation, and then in between you had all the complex numbers? So if you just have real numbers, it's very, very basic. But once you add imaginary numbers and complex numbers, you get rotations. And why, pray tell, are rotations so important? Because when you have rotations, you get oscillation. And in the case of the source formula, which is e to the ix equals cosine x plus I sine x, you get frequencies, you get waveforms. So you have I and complex numbers associated with oscillations, extremely important to waveforms. And this being a frequency reality, a reality of waveforms, oscillations, imaginary numbers, complex numbers are fundamental, literally fundamental. They form the basis of reality, Fourier basis waves. And physicists will try and get rid of this. Let me go back here. And compared to other physical theories, quantum mechanics is special because it has to describe objects that can behave like particles under some conditions and like waves in others. The basic equation of this theory, taken as postulate, is the Schrödinger equation. It describes changes in time of a certain function called the wave function, which is related to the probability distribution of finding a system in a specific state. However, the imaginary number I openly appears next to the wave function in the Schrödinger equation. For decades, there has been a debate as to whether one can create coherent and complete quantum mechanics with real numbers alone. So we decided to find quantum states that could be distinguished from each other only by using complex numbers and imaginary numbers. The decisive moment was the experiment where we created these states and physically checked whether they were distinguishable or not. So, an approach known as quantum resource theory was used for the theoretical description. The experiment itself, with local discrimination between entangled two-photon states, was carried out in the laboratory using linear optic techniques. The quantum states prepared by the researchers turned out to be distinguishable, which proves that complex numbers, which includes imaginary numbers, are an integral, indelible part of quantum mechanics. And again, if you're wondering why are we talking about this, why this is important, is because this is something that we have been saying for years and years and years and years, that quantum physicists will use things like the imaginary number and complex numbers to facilitate their equations and then get rid of them at the end as if they don't exist, which is absurd. And we can know this using reason and logic. Now it has been proved experimentally. Now, do you see how this is something that we have known and can know without doing any sensory experiments? We did not need to do sensory experiments to know this. We can know it rationally and logically by going, hey, look, this is a mathematical reality. Mathematics must be complete, consistent, and perfect. There is the question of what is the square root of -I. This implies necessarily the existence of imaginary numbers. Therefore, imaginary numbers must exist. You can know this rationally and logically. It's just like you can't have up without down. You can't have hot without cold. You can't have left without right. Left implies right. So positive numbers imply negative numbers, which also imply imaginary numbers, which also imply complex numbers. So in essence, what physicists have tried to do is like, oh, well, we like right, but we don't like left. So we're just going to get rid of left. Doesn't exist, but right does. Look, you don't have to do a sensory experiment to know that left exists. By knowing that right exists, you automatically know that left must exist because right implies left. I'm using a very simplistic example here, but you get the idea how that we can use reason and logic to know these things. And this is how we know that this is not a physical reality, but a mathematical reality, by using logic and reason, very similar to the process that I have just described. And people may laugh at this and think this is a silly idea. Well, guess what? Physicists would probably, have laughed at the idea of imaginary numbers and complex numbers being an indispensable part of reality. But guess what? They are indispensable. And so I just want, one of the things here is I want to keep you guys up to date and show you how we are constantly being vindicated. And so, it's up to you. Where are you going to be? Are you going to be in the dead past, sticking with old, outdated, physicalist, empiricist, materialist theories? Or are you going to jump on board into the future with us and Hyperionism and ontological mathematics and know that this is not a material reality, it is a mental reality. It is not a physical reality, it is a mathematical reality. And we can know this using logic and reason. Physicists can continue to plod along at their snail's pace while we go light years into the future. So where are you going to go? You're going to be in the snail's pace with them, or are you going to join us and be with us into the future and help us actualize a new, brilliant, intelligent, rational humanity and world? And this is why we know that we must construct a new world based on these underlying and fundamental ideas. So I know that there was a lot of mathematics in here today. If you're interested in knowing about more of the mathematics of Hyperionism, check out my book, Ontological Mathematics, The Science of the Future. There's also an excellent book called Euler's Formula and General and Special Relativity by Dr. Thomas Stark, who is an awesome ontological mathematician. Highly recommend that. Another intro book by Dr. Cody Newman, great ontological mathematicians. And, I know that videos like this probably aren't as popular as my other videos because they are more math heavy, they are more physics heavy. But you know what? Hey, this is extremely important information. This was why I put this out there for you guys to understand. And if you guys do enjoy these types of videos, let me know. Tell me in the comments, because I could talk about the mathematics behind ontological mathematics and Hyperionism all day long. I could do entire videos talking about, so much. Fourier transform, Dirac deltas, how it relates to the mind, how it relates to monads, and all that sort of thing. It's just, people are usually scared off by equations and things like that. But if that's something you want to see more of, let me know in the comments. But the point here is to understand that we can know mathematically that this is a reality of mind. It's not physical. It's a reality of mathematics, of frequency. And physics needs to undergo a huge paradigm shift to even be able to get a glimpse of what we have been saying for years. Okay, hold on. I am back. So physics usually looks at reality as being three-dimensional, or four-dimensional if you include time. 3 spatial dimensions and 1 time dimension. So total of 4 dimensions. We're not going to get into string theory or M theory or anything like that. But basically speaking, it's looked at as 3 dimensions of space, 1 dimension of time. Now, in Hyperionism and ontological mathematics, this is a 6-dimensional reality. And the reason for that being is if you look at Euler's formula here, we know that reality is based on real and imaginary and complex numbers. So if real numbers are associated with space and imaginary numbers are associated with time, we have to make sure that everything is follows the principle of sufficient reason and is symmetric. So if you have 3 spatial dimensions, which means if you have 3 real axes, in this picture, we only have 1. But you can see paired with every real axis is an imaginary axis. So if you have 3 real axes, 3 dimensions of space, then necessarily you're going to get along with it 3 dimensions of time. And so, in a nutshell, saying this really fast, in Hyperionism, this is a 6-dimensional reality, 3 dimensions of space, and 3 dimensions of time. Time is not 1-dimensional, time is 3-dimensional, and is just another type of space known as imaginary space. So we know that this must be true if you have 3 dimensions of space, because for symmetry considerations, for every real axis you see, we have to include an imaginary axis, which would be associated with time in Hyperionism and ontological mathematics. Now, I could say a hell of a lot more about this. However, I have already talked for quite a bit, but I wanted to throw that in because it is in the title of the video. But if you would like to hear more about this idea, let me know in the comments and I'll do an entire video about it. But again, you know, some people might see, and again, case in point, this may be something that people would laugh at, like, oh yeah, 6-dimensional reality, 3 dimensions of time, and time are imaginary numbers. That's dumb. Okay, but do you see how we were just vindicated with imaginary numbers being crucial to quantum mechanics and the carrying out of these calculations? And previously that would have been something that so like I said, if this seems, wow, so radical to you, and like, oh yeah, no, just like we were vindicated in this article, this is something that we will clearly be vindicated in as well. So reality, if there are 3 spatial dimensions, there must also be 3 time dimensions, meaning that this would be a 6-dimensional reality. You can think of it as a 6-dimensional reality or a 3 complex dimensional reality. So if you're looking at this right now, there are 2 ways to look at this. Either this is 2-dimensional because you have a real and an imaginary axis, that's 2 dimensions, or you can look at this as 1 complex dimension. So reality is a 6-dimensional universe, or alternatively, just said in different words, 3-dimensional if it's complex dimensions. So again, if you want to hear more about that, let me know in the comments. Will BX says, can you explain more about the zeroth dimension? Yes, absolutely. So the zeroth dimension is essentially this. So like I just explained, how this physical reality is 6-dimensional, because if you have 3 real spatial dimensions, necessarily mathematically you have to have 3 imaginary temporal time dimensions. And the singularity is the source domain, and it underlies everything. And the way we can understand this is because if you have something physical has dimensions. It has dimensionality. It has, width, depth, height. It has a location. It can have a temporal location or it can have a spatial location. However, thought and mind is 0-dimensional, right? If you go, if you're looking at your friend over there, your friend's body has space. It has depth. It has dimensionality to it. But what about their thoughts? Well, their thoughts are 0-dimensional. You can't say, oh, there are their thoughts. There they are. Let me get a ruler and measure their thoughts. Their thoughts have no dimensionality. Now, how do we understand this in terms of Hyperionism? Well, in terms of Hyperionism, thoughts are frequency patterns, okay? So thoughts are frequencies, and if we look at this again, going back to the source formula, we looked at this earlier, the source formula generates frequency patterns. These are frequency patterns right here. And if we look at these frequency patterns, and we take their total result, which has to do with integration, but we won't get into that right now. Let me just bring this up here so you can see. If we take these waveforms and look at their total result, and this is what this is doing right now, their total result is 0. Their net result is 0. So we have reality based on frequency patterns, based on waveforms whose net result is 0. The net result is 0. These are and this is thought. This is so thought, mind, mathematics, frequency. These are all different words for the same things. This is a mathematical reality. This is a reality of frequency. This is a reality of mind. All of that are different words for saying the same thing. This is a reality of thought, mathematical thought, and it is zero-dimensional when considered as a whole, net. And again, you can take a look at our diagram when we're talking about the Argand diagram, the Gaussian plane, or the complex plane. And so here we have 2 dimensions. And if you were to add more dimensions, if we were to add 3 real dimensions, we'd get 3 temporal dimensions, 6 dimensions. But anyway, what's at the very heart of it? 0. The zeroth dimension. The zeroth dimension is at the heart of any kind of spatial or temporal dimensions. So if you add up, the net result, the entirety, the total of this Eulerian circle is 0. Because guess what? 1 plus -1 plus I plus negative I, and all the infinite complex numbers in between, their total is 0. The net result is 0. So basically what this means is that the source singularity, the domain of mind, is at the heart of all existence. Just like mind is at the heart of your friend. But you can't see it. But it is what allows your friend to function, move, operate. Just like this physical reality, the mind is what allows it to operate, animate it, have life, have any kind of possibility of existence at all. Lynn Love wants to know if we connect to the zeroth dimension. We are always connected in the zeroth dimension. We exist in the zeroth dimension. It's only through our avatars that we exist in the 6th-dimensional universe. So what we truly are monadic minds. What religion has called the soul. But it's not some kind of airy-fairy mystical object. It's a mathematical object. It's an object. What it is a collection of Fourier basis waves. If you want to know the mathematical definition, it's a complete and consistent set of Fourier basis waves. It's a collection of frequencies that all net to 0. So we are monadic minds. And in the space-time holos, in the 6th-dimensional universe, are eternal minds, souls, if you want to use that word, but don't let that confuse you too much. It's a mathematical object in the 0th dimension, connect to our avatars. And our avatars are what allow us to navigate the physical world. What it's like wearing a VR headset. Okay? When you wear a VR headset, it feels like you're in the game, but you're not really. You're really outside of the game. The VR headset just makes you feel like you are in it. Now, same thing with this reality. Our avatars, our physical senses, they're like the VR headset that make us feel like that we are inside of this reality. But really, we sit outside of it as eternal minds in the 0th dimension. So we are always connected to the 0th dimension. But I think I know what you mean. Yes, we can establish that connection even further by having more explicit access to it. I think that's what you would mean is, can we have more explicit access to it? Because right now we have explicit access to the physical world and more of an implicit access to the 0th dimension. Yes, to have so the right hemispheric functions of the brain is associated with the source singularity, whereas the left hemispheric functions are associated with space and time. If we want to talk about Fourier transforms, it's space-time versus frequency. But essentially, what this means is that by getting our hemispheric interactions to work together in a more integrated and synchronistic way, we can begin to cultivate a stronger connection to the source singularity, the frequency domain, the 0th dimension. And so our intuition is really plugged into that. And we need to use logic and reason to be able to order and make sense of the data that we collect from this domain, because the 0th domain is a non-local domain. It's non-local. It's everything. It's information that is not localized. The space-time domain is local information. It's localized. And the way to understand that localized means there's a location. There's a cup, 5 feet away from me. There's a camera 2 feet away, and things have a specific location. They're localized. In the non-local domain, the frequency domain, there is no location. Information doesn't need a location. Just like when you go to sleep and dream, the dream doesn't really have a location. You know, when you see your friend on the couch sleeping, the dream isn't literally in his head, right? If you cracked open your friend's head, don't do that. I don't recommend you do that. But if you did, you know, take an axe and crack open your friend's head, it's not like a dream would come out of it. A dream is not located in someone's head. So information is non-local. Now, when you're inside of it, there is a location. When you are in the dream, yes, now things are localized. Now in the dream, oh, there's a dream chair 5 dream feet from me, and there's a dream, you know, bird 100 dream feet in the air, or something like that. When you're inside of the information in that localized environment, then you're in the realm of locality. Nell Head says, Zero Dimension, are we all connected to each other via the zeroth dimension? Yes, absolutely, 100%. We are all connected at all times via the zeroth dimension. And again, the way to understand this is, imagine that we were all in the same room together, but we all had VR headsets on. And in the VR game world, we're all in different places in the game. In the game, you know, you could be on one side of the game planet, or on another side of the game universe. You might not even know that some of the other people exist, because in the game, in the VR headset, you're all on completely different parts of the game universe. But if everyone were to take off their headsets, they'd go, oh, hey, we're all right here together. Same thing with reality and the zeroth dimension versus the physical dimensions. In the physical dimensions, it could seem like we're all over the world, or even all over the universe. But at all times, we are intimately connected in the source singularity. I want to give a shout out to our top Patreon supporters, White Rabbit, John, Jiwan, Rex, Naruda, and all our other top supporters who do support. Consider supporting on Patreon. It's the best way to support my work, ensures that I will be able to continue to create, and you do get access to our weekly secret live streams.